Miriam had been blind for 19 years, and in all that time, she had never once been afraid of the dark. What frightened her on the last Tuesday of March was the cat. Not because Sable had done something violent or sudden. Not because he had hissed or scratched or made any of the sounds that animals make when they are reacting to fear. What frightened Miriam was the opposite of all that. What frightened her was that Sable, who slept through thunderstorms and ignored strangers at the door, and had never in 11 years shown interest in fodder, anything that did not directly involve food or warmth, had been standing completely still at the foot of her bed since 3 in the morning, facing the corner. She knew this because she could hear him, not his movement, his stillness, the particular quality of a living thing holding itself motionless in a room. The way the air around a statue feels different from the air around an empty chair. She had reached out and touched him at 3:14. His body was rigid, not tense in the way of a frightened animal, rigid in the way of something concentrating with everything it had. She had said his name. He had not responded. And what she felt then, what moved through her in the dark of that bedroom, in the house she had lived in alone for 6 years, was not the fear of what the cat might be looking at. It was something older and quieter than that. It was the fear of already knowing. Miriam Voss was 61 years old. She had lost her sight at 42 to a degenerative condition that her doctors had identified early enough to prepare her, but not early enough to stop, and she had spent the years since then building a life that worked without it. This was not a small thing. It was also not the extraordinary thing that people who still had their sight sometimes implied. It was when they said things like, "You are so brave," or "I don't know how you do it." It was simply her life, reconstructed from different materials than before, functional and specific, and hers. She lived in a house in a small town in Western Virginia that she had shared for 22 years with her husband, Dex, and for the last 6 with no one but Sable, whom Dex had brought home as a kitten 3 months before he died, and who had therefore arrived in her life at the precise moment when she had most needed something that required her attention without requiring her explanation. Dex had died of a heart attack at 58. Quickly, the doctor said, which was meant to be a comfort and sometimes was. She had kept the house because it was hers in the way that only places you have grieved inside can be yours. Not because of the happy years, though there had been many, but because of the specific geography of loss that she had navigated within those walls until she knew every room of it by feel, including the grief, including the places where it was still dense, and the places where it had thinned to something she could move through without stopping. She knew where everything was. This was not metaphor. She knew the exact number of steps from her bed to the bathroom, from the kitchen to the back door, from the front hallway to the chair by the window, where she read in the afternoons with her fingers moving across the page. She knew the sounds of the house, which floorboards spoke under weight, which window rattled when the wind came from the north, which drawer stuck in humid weather. She knew the sounds of Sable, and she had never heard him sound like this before. Like nothing at all. By 4 in the morning, he had not moved. Miriam had gotten up, which was not something she did lightly at 4 in the morning, and she had gone to the kitchen and made tea, because tea was the thing she did when she could not sleep and needed her hands occupied. She had stood at the kitchen counter with the cup warming her palms, and she had listened to the house. The bedroom was at the end of the hall. She could not hear Sable from the kitchen, but she knew he was still there. She knew it the way she knew most things now, not through any sense she could name precisely, but through an accumulated literacy of her environment that had sharpened in the years since her sight had gone, and that she trusted more than she had trusted anything in a long time. Something was in the corner of her bedroom. She did not know what this meant. She was not a person who believed easily in things she could not account for. She had been a high school science teacher for 23 years, and she had a methodical mind and a high threshold for claims that exceeded their evidence. And she was aware that a blind woman alone in a house at 4 in the morning was in exactly the psychological conditions most likely to produce sensations of presence that had mundane explanations. She stood at the kitchen counter and she considered the mundane explanations. A mouse or a rat, which would account for the cat's attention, if not for the quality of it. A smell she was not detecting, but Sable was, which was possible. His olfactory range was vastly beyond hers, and there were chemical processes in old houses that produced no human perceptible signal. A reflection of some kind, light from a passing car caught on a surface and projected onto the corner wall, though she could not construct the geometry of this convincingly given the position of the window. She went through each possibility with the same methodical care she had brought to 30 years of evidence and elimination. And then she put down her tea and walked back down the hall to the bedroom. Sable had not moved. She sat on the edge of the bed. She placed her hand on his back again, still rigid, still facing the corner. His breathing was slow and deliberate in a way that suggested not fear but attention, the breathing of something that was committing all available resources to a single act of perception. She turned her head toward the corner. She said quietly into the room, "Dex." She had not planned to say it. It was not something she believed in, or not something she had believed in before this moment, or not something she had language for now that the moment had passed. She said it the way you say the name of someone you have been thinking about without knowing you were thinking about them. The way a name surfaces when the conditions are right, from some depth where it has been sitting all along. The room was silent. Sable made a sound she had never heard him make in 11 years. Not a meow, not a purr. Something between them, lower from the chest, the kind of sound that vibrates in the sternum rather than the throat. And then he turned around, walked to her side of the bed, and lay down against her leg. Whatever had been in the corner was gone. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry, which surprised her. She had expected to cry. What she felt instead was something she did not have adequate language for. Not comfort exactly, not grief exactly, but something that contained both and was larger than either, the way a sound contains both its note and its silence and cannot be understood without both. She lay down. She slept. In the morning she told no one. This was not because she was embarrassed, though she was, slightly, in the rational daylight way of someone who has a scientific education and a story that does not fit inside it. It was because she did not yet know what she had experienced, and she had learned in 61 years that there was a specific kind of experience that needed time before it could be spoken without being diminished. She went through her morning, coffee, the radio, Sable's breakfast, the brief walk to the end of the driveway, and back that she took every day for air, and because it mattered to her to move through the outside world on her own terms. The town around her was waking up in its usual way. She could hear the school bus 2 streets over. She could smell that someone on the block was baking something. The world was entirely ordinary, and she was inside it and also slightly outside it, the way you are the morning after something has shifted the ground under you without breaking it. She did not call her daughter Petra. She called her instead 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon, because by Friday she had turned the experience over enough times that she thought she could describe it without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. Petra was 34, which meant she had been 28 when Dex died, old enough to have had years of adult relationship with her father, and young enough that those years had felt, at the time, like the beginning of something, rather than its entirety. She lived 2 hours away, in Richmond, and she called her mother every Sunday without fail, which Miriam appreciated without ever saying so directly, because directness about that kind of thing had never been the language between them. Miriam told her what had happened. Petra was quiet for a long moment after. Then she said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." What Petra told her took 17 minutes. Miriam sat in the chair by the window while Petra talked, with her hand flat on the armrest, the way she sat when she needed to be still, and she listened. 3 weeks earlier, Petra said she had gone to a grief counselor for the first time. Not for anything acute. It had been 6 years since her father died, and she was functional. She was fine by most measures. But because she had been having dreams about him that were becoming harder to dismiss as random neural noise, dreams that were specific in a way her ordinary dreams were not, with his voice and his particular smell, and the exact weight of his hand on her shoulder, the way she remembered it from childhood. She had not told her mother about the counselor because she had not wanted her mother to feel like she was still, 6 years on, actively struggling. She had not told her about the dreams for the same reason. The counselor's name was Dr. Ren Ashebe, and she was in her 50s, and she specialized in grief that had calcified, grief that had stopped moving, that had organized itself into the architecture of a person's life in ways that looked like function, but were actually load-bearing walls built around absence. Petra had gone twice. On the second session, 3 days before Miriam's night with Sable, Petra had said something to Dr. Ashebe that she had never said out loud before. She had said that what she couldn't let go of was the feeling that her father had left things unfinished. Not with the family, with her mother specifically. That in the last year of his life, before the heart attack, there had been a distance between them that nobody had addressed and that had not been resolved before he died, and that Petra had carried for 6 years as a quiet, specific dread that her mother was alone, not just in the practical sense, but in the deeper sense of having been left in the middle of a conversation. She had said this out loud for the first time at 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Miriam did the calculation in her head. Virginia was one time zone. 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday was 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Sable had stood at the corner of her bedroom at 3 in the morning on a Thursday. 12 hours. She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "Petra, what was the unfinished thing?" Another silence. Longer. Petra said, "I think he knew he was going to die. Not the heart attack specifically, but something. I think he knew something was wrong, and he didn't tell you because he didn't want to worry you, and then he ran out of time. I found something in his study. After, I never showed you because I didn't know how." Miriam said, "What did you find?" What Petra had found was a letter, not finished, not sealed, written in Dex's handwriting on 2 sheets of paper that he had folded and placed inside a book in his study, a biography of a naturalist that Miriam had given him one birthday and that he had read twice and kept on the second shelf. She had found it in the first weeks after his death, when she was going through his things, and she had read it, and she had not been able to decide what to do with it, and she had put it back inside the book, and she had taken the book home to Richmond, and it had sat on her own shelf for 6 years. The letter was addressed to Miriam. It was unfinished. It stopped mid-sentence, in the way that things stop when the person writing them has decided to come back later and hasn't yet figured out what comes next, and then hasn't come back, and then run out of time. What it said, in the portion that was complete, was this: that Dex had been diagnosed with a heart condition 8 months before he died, which Miriam had not known, which he had not told her, because the doctors had said it was manageable, and he had believed them, and had not wanted to add fear to her life when the outcome, as he understood it, was not fear-worthy. That he had been wrong not to tell her, and he had known for months that he was wrong, and he had been trying for months to find the way to say it that would not feel like a betrayal of the 6 years she had spent trusting him to be honest with her. That what he wanted her to know, before he found the right words for the rest of it, was that the distance she had felt from him in the last year was not distance. It was the weight of something he was carrying alone, because he had made the wrong decision about whose weight it was to carry. It stopped there, mid-thought. The rest of it was blank paper. Miriam did not speak for a long time after Petra finished reading. Petra waited. Outside, the March afternoon had moved into early evening, and the light had changed in the way. Miriam couldn't see but could feel the temperature shift, the quality of the air through the slightly open window, the particular silence that came to the street at this hour. She thought about 6 years. She thought about the distance she had felt in the last year of Dex's life, which she had believed was her fault, her increasing blindness, her increasing dependence, the way she had sometimes thought that she was a burden he was managing rather than a person he was choosing. She had carried that for 6 years as a weight she had never named to anyone, not to Petra, not to her sister, not to the therapist she had seen twice in the first year and then stopped seeing, because she was functional and there were people with greater needs. She had carried it in the specific silent way of someone who has decided that a thing is probably true and that saying it out loud will only make it more true. She thought about Sable at the foot of the bed, facing the corner, the sound he had made. Whatever had been in that room at 3 in the morning on a Thursday, she was not going to name it. She was not going to build a theology around it. She was going to hold it the way you hold something that has no container that fits it yet. Whatever it had been had arrived 12 hours after her daughter had said out loud for the first time that she thought her father had left something unfinished with her mother. She did not think this was coincidence. She also could not tell you what it was instead. She said to Petra, "Bring me the letter." Petra said, "Yes." She drove down that same evening. She arrived at 9:30. Miriam heard the car in the driveway and stood at the front door. And when Petra came up the walk, she opened her arms. And Petra walked into them the way she had when she was 9 years old, and the world had done something that required her mother's arms specifically. And they stood on the front porch in the March cold, holding each other in the particular way of people who have been carrying the same thing separately for too long. Sable sat in the hallway behind Miriam and watched them through the screen door. He was calm. Whatever he had been watching 3 nights ago, he was not watching it anymore. Petra stayed for 4 days. They read the letter together, sitting at the kitchen table, Petra reading it aloud while Miriam listened with her hands flat on the table, the same way she had sat in the chair 3 days before. Petra read it twice. The second time her voice was steadier than the first. Afterward they talked about Dex the way they had not talked about him since the first year, not around him, not about what he had meant and how he was missed, but directly, with the specific details and contradictions and imperfections that a person becomes available for only after enough time has passed that you can see them whole. They talked about his stubbornness, which had been considerable. They talked about his particular way of showing love, which had always been through action rather than language, and which had sometimes made the language feel absent when it was actually just encoded differently. They talked about the last year and the distance, and what it had cost both of them to carry their own versions of the explanation. They talked about the letter, about what it meant that he had started it and not finished it and not thrown it away. Miriam said she thought the not throwing it away was the important part. Petra said she thought so too. On the third evening, Petra asked her mother what she thought had happened with Sable. She asked it carefully, in the way she had learned to ask her mother things that were careful, directly, without softening it into something smaller, because Miriam's preference had always been for the direct question, even when the answer was uncertain. Miriam thought about it. She said she didn't know. She said she was not going to claim to know. She said that in 61 years, she had encountered 3 or 4 things that did not fit inside her understanding of how the world operated, and that she had spent a long time trying to fit them in anyway, and that she had decided sometime in the last few years that the more honest position was simply to hold them as things she did not understand rather than forcing them into shapes that diminished what they actually were. She said, "I think Sable saw something. I think whatever it was had been trying to reach me for a long time. I think it found a way in through the one thing in that room that was paying close enough attention." Petra looked at Sable, who was sitting on the kitchen windowsill with his tail moving slowly, watching the dark yard. She said, "He's always been weird." Miriam laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 4 days, and the sound of it filled the kitchen in a way that both of them felt without saying so. A sound of a room that had been held carefully for a long time, suddenly given permission to breathe. Petra left on a Sunday morning. They stood in the driveway, the way they always stood at the end of visits, not wanting to begin the formal goodbye, staying in the last few minutes of the together. Petra had the letter in her bag, the original, which Miriam had asked her to keep safe. She had also, at Miriam's direction, read it into her phone as a voice memo, which Miriam could listen to whenever she needed to. She had listened to it once already, the night before. She had lain in her bed with her phone on the pillow and Dex's voice in her memory, filling in the pauses between. Petra's words, and Sable at the foot of the bed in his usual position, and the corner of the room, just the corner of the room. And she had listened to the unfinished sentence reach its end and stop, and she had held the blank silence after it, and she had said into the dark, "I know. It's all right. I know." Whether that was true or not, she couldn't say yet. It was true enough for tonight. Petra backed out of the driveway, and Miriam stood on the front step and listened to the car until it was gone. The neighborhood was quiet in the Sunday morning way. Someone 3 houses down was mowing. A dog was barking twice and stopping, twice and stopping. The pattern of a dog that has found something interesting but not alarming. Sable came and sat beside her leg on the front step. She reached down and put her hand on him, and he was warm and solid and present in the way that living things are present. And she stood there in the March morning and let the sun that she couldn't see move across her face. Somewhere in that house was 11 years of a life built after the life she had expected. Somewhere in it was a corner where a cat had stood at 3 in the morning, facing something she would never be able to name. Somewhere in it was the particular geography of grief that had become so familiar she no longer noticed she was moving through it. She thought about Dex sitting at his desk in the years before he died, with a blank piece of paper in front of him, trying to find the sentence that would carry the weight of what he needed to say without breaking under it. She thought about him putting the paper back in the book because he hadn't found it yet. She thought about him running out of time. She had spent 6 years believing the distance between them, in that last year, had been her fault. It had taken a blind woman, a black cat, a corner of a room, and a letter folded in a book to close that distance. She would not say she understood it. She would say this, that the things we leave unfinished do not always stay that way. That sometimes, through channels we have no instruments for, through a door we didn't know was open, through the unwavering attention of an animal that noticed what we couldn't, sometimes the unfinished thing finds its way home. Sable pressed his head against her hand. She stood there until she was ready to go back inside. She was not in a hurry. Neither, it seemed, was he. 6 months later, in September, Miriam donated Dex's books to the town library, the ones she had kept for years, because letting them go had felt like letting go of something she wasn't ready to let go of. She kept 12. A naturalist biography was one of them. She kept it because of where the letter had been. She kept it because some things deserve to stay on the shelf, not for what they are, but for what they once held. And she kept it because Sable, on the day she carried the donated boxes to the front door, walked past every other box without stopping. He stopped at that one. He sat down beside it. And he looked up at her the way he had looked up at her on the front step in March, steady, certain, seeing something just past the edge of what she could perceive, and then he walked away. She stood there with her hand on the box for a long moment. Then she picked it up, carried it to the library, and left it there. The naturalist biography she brought home and put back on the shelf. Some things you give away. Some things stay.